Amen. Well, what I wanted to talk about tonight was some of the ways in which God works in circumstances that we know we need to know about. If we understand the spiritual battle and we understand what's at stake, we also need to know what God will and what God won't do, and what part we play in this. And so much of having any kind of victory in the spiritual battle is standing on our feet, and making an impact has to do with staying in union with Christ. And again, I'm back to our lead verse, Psalm 144:1, that God trains us for war. And then we've got to have the right attitude. So if we hop over to Philippians 4:13, this is an interesting verse, both in what it says and what it does not say. Because what this tells us, Philippians 4:13, is a lot about the internal strength that we have, how the right attitude helps us and moves us down the checkerboard. And it's one that's misquoted, mistranslated a lot. You're very familiar. I'm not sure. Is it the King James Version that says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me? Which, of course, we can't. And Paul couldn't either. When we look at the situation here, this is Philippians. Where was Paul? Paul was in jail, chained to a soldier. He wasn't even sure, when you read Philippians 1, he wasn't even sure that he was going to live and not die. So if the text read, I can do all things, then my question would be, well, then, let those chains drop off your arms and go walking out of there. Which, of course, he didn't and he couldn't. And so the text isn't telling us we can do all things, and it doesn't help us to build a confidence on a slippery slope or on a cloud. We've got to build our trust and build our confidence in what God really promises and what God has really done. And so, for example, after working for a long time on this, and Jerry and I, and before him, Joshua and I, looked at this because, of course, this is a very important verse. And the Greek word strength is ischua, which is strength. And then in all, and you got to decide, in all what, and the idea would be situations or circumstances. So what you end up with is, I have strength for all situations. I have strength for all circumstances. You mean you have strength when you're in a Roman prison and you shouldn't be there, you were framed and you're chained to a soldier? And Paul's like, yes, I have strength in this situation. And where does he get it? In union with him who empowers me. And that's always where we get our strength. We get our strength from being in union with Christ who empowers us. And the empowers is in the passive voice in the Greek, and that becomes important because a lot of times we over-exaggerate who we are or what we can do, meaning your prayer about us being in the flesh and just being flesh and blood people is exactly right on. I mean, we're pretty weak in and of ourselves. I love the fourth day and God spoke the sun, the moon, the galaxies into being, because we look up and we see stars, but now through Hubble telescope and stuff, we know that a lot of those, quote, stars, unquote, are actually galaxies. And so, we've got a God that out of nothing spoke the galaxies, and I'm not really even able to speak a frog into being. I can clear a place on my desk and, frog become nothing, so we're pretty weak. So it's through God who empowers us. We're empowered from the outside in. And if we understand that, we can deal with the situations that we're in through Christ. So there's, in the spiritual battle, there's lies that we have to avoid. And one of those is, I can do this by myself. And the answer is we can't. And we want to make sure that we're kind of keeping the spiritual battle in our ability, our position as a player, if you will, on the tip of our tongue. We don't want to get into a situation where we only call upon Christ when we actually have a personal need. You know, we want to make sure that we're in fellowship with Christ, calling upon Christ, talking with Christ, you know, all the time. And then Christ for himself, he needed God. You know, if you take a look at John 5:30, and in John chapter 5, verse 30, you know, here's Jesus, and what does he say? He says, I am not, here's Jesus, I'm not able to do anything on my own. That's how I feel. Jesus felt the same way. Then you look at his life and how powerful he was, and it's like, well, how did you do all that if you can't do it on your own? And the answer is Jesus was in league with God. And now that Jesus is at the right hand of God and he has all authority, then the same thing goes with us. Look at John 15:5. And in John 15 and verse 5, he says, I am the vine, you are the branches. And you guys know how grapes work. You know, there's that big, thick vine that feeds all the little branches. And where are the grapes? Well, they're on the branches. You know, the real fruit. We are such players in this. Even in the illustration that Christ used, that I'm the vine and you're the branches, that, you know, the vine doesn't have any grapes on it. The branches do. I mean, this is Christ. He gives us the ministry of reconciliation. He gives us the word of reconciliation. He empowers us to do work. He empowers us to bring forth fruit. He says, I am the vine, you are the branches. The one who lives in union with me and I in him. That is the one who will bear much fruit, because apart from me, you are not able to do anything. So here's Christ saying, oh, I can't do anything without God. And he says, you guys can't do anything without me. And so that puts this whole thing in perspective, and we have to realize that. And so many people, it's, you know, there's a kind of a macho thing in America where it's like, if I have to ask for help or get help, then I feel I'm embarrassed, or I feel bad about it, or that kind of thing. And the Christian world is totally different. You know, Christ said, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there will I be also. So we want to round up other Christians and work with them and listen to the voice of God and be a team and move forward as a team. And then the next thing we need to be aware of is that no matter how well equipped we are in the world, like, you know, Ecclesiastes, there's a line that says wealth is a defense, and it is. There's a lot of things that wealth, if you're wealthy, you know, things are easier. If your car breaks down, you just get it fixed. You know, if a bird flies into your window and breaks it, you just get it fixed. There's a lot of things you can throw money at, and money is a bit of a defense, but it's not the ultimate. And if we look at Ecclesiastes 9:11, and Rob, who kind of had my back today, and as we would translate Ecclesiastes, and he was saying, you know, you tried to do this, and it's amazing. And you get down there with your little microscope, and then you kind of leave out a word here or there or something. But Ecclesiastes 9:11 starts a new section in Ecclesiastes, which is why Ecclesiastes 9:11 starts out with, then I turned. And that exact phrase occurs a couple times in Ecclesiastes, and it's where he's talking about one thing, and then he finishes it out and he talks about something else. So we know he's starting kind of a new section here, a new thought. Then I turned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor is the battle to the strong, and also the wise do not have bread, nor do the people of understanding have riches, nor does favor come to people of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. And what's the Bible saying here? The Bible's saying, don't get to where you think you're so well equipped that God becomes a side issue. well, I don't really need God. I've got a huge retirement account. I don't really need God because I've got the best weapon on the battlefield. I don't really need God because, and the fact of the matter is we always need God. What the devil is doing behind the scenes in the spiritual world makes it come to pass that, I don't care how fast you are, that doesn't mean you're going to win the race. I don't care how strong you are, that doesn't mean you're going to win the battle. I don't care how wise you are, that doesn't mean you're going to figure out how to make money and have food, and that kind of thing. So there's a false confidence that we can have in life. One time I said I said kind of in a teaching, I said the only life insurance is salvation. And some lady got mad at me and said, "Oh, I have life insurance that isn't salvation." It's like, no, you missed the point. Your life insurance doesn't save your life. Your life insurance gives money to people after you die, but it doesn't insure your life. There's only one actual life insurance, and that's God, and that's salvation. And so we have to know about our, relying on God. I'd like to read, let's go to Psalm 33. Wonderful psalm here in Psalm 33. Talking about how God really is the one we need to lean on. If we go to verse 16, in Psalm 33:16, there's no king saved by the multitude of an army. A mighty man is not delivered by his great strength. A horse is a deceptive thing for one's deliverance. Neither can it rescue any by its great power. And it goes on. But that's basically the same thing Ecclesiastes was saying. That you don't want to rely on your fleshly situation. You want to rely on God. It's interesting that men who had great victories in history, like I think about George Washington. George Washington was acutely aware that there were more British in their army than he had soldiers in his army. That the British soldiers he was fighting were better trained than his men. That the British soldiers he were fighting were generally better armed than his men. That they had a better supply line than his men. And so he knew he wasn't going to have any victory without God. And George Washington was a great man of prayer. And also, there was no cussing in George Washington's army. If you used a 4-letter word, you were flogged, because he understood the command of God against obscenity. Ephesians 5:3, there must not be obscenity. And he just said, if we want God's help in our army, then we're going to have to clean up our act. And he made sure they did. And so if we're going to win, we've got to do at least a good job. I mean, nobody's perfect, but we do at least a good job of kind of cleaning up our act. And then, we look for, okay, how can help and how can God help? And God helps in loads of different ways. And, one way God can help is he can help by miracles. Now, does God promise that every time you're in trouble, he's going to do a miracle? No. But can we ask for a miracle knowing that God has done them? Yeah, absolutely we can. We absolutely can do that. Can you think of some times that God did a miracle in the Bible that delivered people or helped people?
Parting the Red Sea.
Yeah, parting the Red Sea is a great one. Michelle, you were going to say something, you were muted.
Yeah, was it Elijah with the woman with the oil? Well, her son, she needed to have bread, that she shared the last of her bread with the prophet, but then there was bread the next day, or grain the next day.
Yeah, exactly. That, what kept them from starving to death? Precisely. There's so many miracles that God has done. And, God's not through doing miracles. He's not. And that's something that we can pray for and we can ask for. You know, talking about the Red Sea, let's look at Exodus 14:5. This is one of, you know, when people are thinking about miracles, this isn't one that, you know, necessarily people think of, but it's one that I think is really cute. So here are the Israelites, and you're exactly right, Rob. This is about the time of the parting of the Red Sea. In verse 5 of Exodus 14, it was told the king of Egypt that the people had fled. So they're leaving Egypt, and the heart of Pharaoh and of his servants. And this is what you would call the pregnant use of the word servants. This is not like Pharaoh's butler and baker. This is his chief army men, and they're called his servants. The heart of Pharaoh and of his servants was changed toward the people. Well, changed, yeah, because they just let him go, and now they're saying, wait a minute, what is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us? He prepared his chariot and took his army with him. And then, let's see, so they overtook them. They pursued after them. So they're chasing the Israelites. So they chase and they chase, and we get down to verse 25. Verse 21, Moses stretches his hand over the sea, and the sea divided. Verse 23, the Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the middle of the sea. And then verse 25, you know, the Egyptians are catching up. They're chasing the Israelites down. The Israelites, it's looking like, oh, brother, we're not going to make it out the other side of the sea and really escape. And then verse 25, he took off their chariot wheels. Well, that'll do it. You know, how would you like to be? You're chasing somebody down in your car and all the wheels fall off. You're not going to go very far. And that's just, you know, one of the many miracles that God did in the helping of delivering his people. You know, the walls of Jericho fell down. He threw hailstones down on the Canaanite army. He made the sun stand still for a day or whatever it was, so that Joshua could fight the Canaanites. I mean, there's so many different miracles that God did, and that's just, you know, miracles that help give you victory. But then there's, you know, those are big miracles that you can see, but then there's like little miracles that you probably don't even know about. Let's look at Genesis 35. And in Genesis 35 is an interesting situation, because Jacob's running away from, you know, moving away from Laban and stuff. And basically verse 4, Jacob's family gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that were in their hands. You know, gosh, I mean, this is Jacob's family. What do? They pick up little idols along the way. And Jacob at least had the wherewithal to realize they were going to get, but, you know, they were going to make things tough with God. He had to get rid of them. So he gathered up all the foreign gods and the rings that were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak. Verse 5, they traveled, and a terror of God was on the cities that were around them. So they didn't pursue the sons of Jacob. Now, how would that look? Here's Jacob, and he's moving from the north to the south, and he's moving through enemy territory. And all he knows is, wow, this is really a blessing that nobody's coming out to get us. Yeah, he was probably prepared to have to run or have to fight, and yet he went right through the heart of enemy territory, and nobody came out to attack him. And my gut feeling is that at that time it was going on, he didn't know why. He was thankful for it. He was blessed by it, but he didn't know why. He's just like, okay, God, thank you. Maybe they don't notice us. Who knows? But then what we know from the record that Moses wrote down, it says a terror of God was on the cities that were around them. So God can set things up in the periphery that you don't even know about, that's saving you and helping you and blessing you. And then God can take that a step further and show you what to do to conquer the enemy or to get past your problems. Let's look at Joshua chapter 6. In Joshua chapter 6 is the destruction of Jericho. But it's real interesting the way this comes down, because if you look at what it took, like when one country would attack another and siege the walled cities, they had siege engines, they had sappers that dug tunnels, they had the siege warfare down to a T. The Assyrians were masters at it, for example, which is how they swept around the Fertile Crescent. But the Israelites coming out of Egypt had no experience with this at all. So verse 1, God told the Israelites to take Jericho. Verse 1 of Joshua 6, now Jericho was tightly shut up because of the children of Israel. No one went out, no one came in. I mean, the gates are shut. Yahweh said to Joshua, behold, I've given Jericho into your hand with its king and the mighty men of valor. All your men of war are to march around the city, going around once. And God then just lays out the strategy for how that was going to happen. And of course they did that. And then when they shouted and the walls fell down. So God can guide us in what to do, even when we just really, things don't, look too easy on their own. God can also, and this is interesting, if we ask, God will sometimes show you what other people are up to. And by the way, this is interesting because this is where we have to work with God closely enough that we trust what we're hearing, if you will. And a lot of times you won't hear like an audible voice of God, but you'll have a knowing of this is what's going on in this situation. And we need to learn to trust that. More often than not, that is the voice of God. But if you look at 1 Kings 20:22, and this you're very familiar with, where God would reveal the plans of the enemy. So 1 Kings chapter 20, and in verse 22, let's see. So here's the king of Israel, and Syria is coming to fight with him, and Syria has a bigger army, more well-equipped, better financed army. Verse 22, the prophet came near to the king of Israel and said to him, go, strengthen yourself and mark and see what you do. For at the return of the year, the king of Syria will come up against you. So now the king knew who was coming, and he knew when he was coming, and he could prepare. And that can work for us. We can do the same thing. God can help us by revealing the plans of the enemy. God did that a number of times through the Old Testament. And then something else that God can do, and this again is behind the scenes, that we wouldn't think that even really that it may be so easy to say, well, this is just some kind of coincidence, but God can turn people against each other so that they not only defeat themselves, but give you the victory. Loads of examples of that. I guess, gosh, let's do the one in Chronicles. Let's go to 2 Chronicles chapter 20. This is a real interesting one because it involves King Jehoshaphat, who was a very godly king. But in 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 1, it came to pass after this, the children of Moab and the children of Ammon, and with them some of the Meunites came up against Jehoshaphat to battle. And some came who told Jehoshaphat, saying, a great multitude is coming against you from beyond the Dead Sea, from Edom. That means they're coming around the south end of the Dead Sea. Behold, they are in Hazanon Tamar, that is in Gedi. So they're already halfway up the Dead Sea. So they are at that point, let's see, 25, 35. They're about 40 miles from Jerusalem when they are there. Verse 3, Josaphat was alarmed and set himself to seek Yahweh. He proclaimed a fast throughout Judah. And Judah gathered themselves together to seek help from Yahweh. They came out of all the cities of Judah to seek Yahweh because they knew we're not going to be able to do this on their own. And so now Jehoshaphat gathers up all these people and he prays. And look at his prayer in verse 12, the honesty here. Oh God, will you not judge them? For we have no might against this great company that comes against us, nor do we know what to do, but our eyes are on you. And that's such an honest prayer. God, that's a much bigger army than we've got. And so we're looking to you. And so what does God do? How does God answer that? Go down to verse 22. So let's see. Verse 22, believe his prophets and wait a minute, I'm in the wrong verse. That would explain that. Okay, so good, verse 22. When they began to sing and praise, Yahweh set an ambush against the children of Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir, that's Edom, who had come against Judah, and they were defeated. For the children of Ammon and Moab stood up against the inhabitants of Mount Seir to utterly kill and destroy them. And when they had made an inhabitants of Mount Seir, they all helped to destroy one another. And when Judah came to the place overlooking the wilderness, they looked at the multitude, and they were dead bodies fallen to the earth. There were none who escaped. The entire three armies of three nations getting together, not a man was left. They all killed themselves. And that's something that we can pray for. Lord, confuse the enemy. Lord, turn the enemy against each other. We're trying to protect ourselves. We have the right to pray to protect ourselves. When we're praying this way, we want to be aware of the fact that we're not just praying for a political agenda. We're praying for ourselves and our families and our faith and to protect ourselves. And God can do that. Other ways that God can help, he can, and just I'll throw some of these out, but God can help by strengthening you. Number of times in the scripture where God gave people supernatural strength. We see that with Samson. God can help you by supplying the provisions you need. And you brought up the God's feeding Elijah when there was no food, that God can give provisions. Let's see. And this is one, too, I think that's really important for us, particularly as we move into leadership, that God can reveal to you why we are having problems, because a lot of times there are problems in a fellowship or in a relationship or in a family because of, say, one bad apple in the group. And God can reveal that. And in our day and time, it's not politically correct to point out somebody as the problem. But the fact of the matter is, the Bible's very clear that there are people that get into a group and they are the ones that cause the problem. We can see that. Let's look at, again, back to Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Last verse in the chapter. Is that 9:18? Let's see. Yeah, 9:18 says, wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. Now we have to be aware of that. We have to be willing to ferret out the problem child. If we look at in Joshua's life, Joshua chapter 7, there was a man named Achan. Joshua chapter 7. And the record here is Israel, after conquering Jericho, then they go up to this little town of Ai, and they got beaten in battle. So this is, let's start in verse 10. And of course, Joshua, verse 8, Joshua's praying because Israel had just been beaten in war. And he said, "Oh Lord, what can I say after that Israel has turned their backs before their enemies? For the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land will hear of it and will surround us and cut off our name from the earth. And what will you do for your great name?" Verse 10, I love this. Yahweh said to Joshua, "Get up. Why is it that you've fallen on your face? Israel has sinned. Yes, they've even transgressed my covenant that I commanded them. Yes, they've even taken of the devoted things and have also stolen and also deceived. They've even put it among their own things. Therefore, the children of Israel cannot stand before their enemies." And so Joshua had to go and ferret out who was the problem. And once the problem was taken care of, then Joshua was able to have victory. And that's something that we need to be able to do also. Then I want to close with the fact that we're employing God for help, but a lot of times what we need to do is make sure that we're putting in the proper amount of effort. And a great example of this is Joshua. So let's go to the book of Joshua. And in Joshua chapter 10, well, we're in Joshua already, so let's go to chapter 10. And you probably remember the record of the Gibeonite deception, when the Gibeonites came to Joshua and they said, "Oh, we've been traveling a long time," and they deceived Joshua, but Joshua made a covenant with them. And then because Joshua made a covenant with them, he had to protect them in war. And basically, this man named Adoni-Zedek, he rounds up a whole bunch of people and he's going to attack Jerusalem. So it says, verse 5 of Joshua 10, "Therefore the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon, gathered themselves together and went up, they and all their armies, and encamped against Gibeon." So you got this one little town, and there's 5 city kingdoms that have rounded up their armies and are attacking this one little town. So verse 6, "The men of Gibeon sent to Joshua to the camp to Gilgal, saying, 'Do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us. For all the kings of the Amorites that live in the hill country have gathered together against us.'" And then Joshua, of course, he had a commitment to help the men of Gibeah. But, Gibeon is way up in the hill country. It's 7 or so miles north of Jerusalem. Joshua's camped down in the Jordan Valley. And what does he do? It says, verse 7, "So Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the mighty men of valor. Yahweh said to Joshua, 'Do not fear them, for I have delivered them into your hand. Not a man of them will stand before you.'" That seems so positive, the prophet or however, "Don't fear them, I've delivered them, not a man of them will stand before you." And then that sounds like a slam dunk. Like basically I like the big bad wolf, I walk up the hill, blow with my breath, and all these people die or something. And that's not at all what it involved. So Yahweh said, "Don't fear them." Verse 9, "Joshua therefore came on them suddenly. He went up from Gilgal all night." So they can imagine Joshua's army. They didn't sleep during the day. They had a regular day. They were, had night sleep the night before, and then they worked all day and did the things they needed to do. And then all of a sudden, this guy shows up from Gibeon and says, "Wow, we're in a whole bunch of trouble, and you've got a commitment to save us." So at that point, what did Joshua do? He didn't say, "Oh, well, my guy, it's been a long day. We've really been busy. Yeah, let's get a good night's sleep and we'll start out in the morning." No, Joshua knew that they'd made a covenant with the men of Gibeon. So he rounds up his soldiers and says, "Guys, weapon up, dudes, because we're walking all night uphill, because the Jordan Valley's 3,000 feet below where they had to get to fight at Gibeon." And so Joshua and his men marched all night long. And it was because of that, when they show up in the morning, of course, the Amorite armies weren't expecting that. Yahweh threw them into confusion, verse 10, before Israel, and he killed them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and chased them by the way of the ascent of Beth Horon, and struck them to Azekah and to Makkedah. Verse 11, and it came to pass as they fled before Israel, while they were at the descent of Beth Horon, in other words, they're running down to the west from the hill country in central Israel, that Yahweh cast great stones from heaven on them to Azekah, and they died. And there were more who died from the hailstones than who the children of Israel killed with the sword. And Joshua spoke to Yahweh in that day. So Yahweh now, and I like this because now the men have been up all day, and then they marched all night, and now they've been fighting the whole blasted day. And I'm sure, the sun is beginning to set, and men didn't usually fight at night. And so I'm sure Joshua's army's like, "Wow, this is really challenging, but we're going to get a break here in a few hours. The sun's going to set." And then what happens? Joshua spoke to Yahweh in verse 12, "Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and you moon in the valley of Ajalon." And the sun stood still and the moon stayed until the nation avenged themselves. And you can see Joshua's army can look out going, "What happened to the sun? Isn't the sun supposed to set? We're looking for a break here." And Joshua just spoke, and God said, "Done." Just simply stop the sun so that they could avenge themselves. They were supposed to kill all those people anyway. Joshua was like, "Shoot, I got to kill all these people anyway. I might as well get them now while they're all gathered together and outside of their fortified cities." So he was a consummate warrior, and he knew what needed to be done. So he commanded the sun to stand still, and God actually did that for him. It says in verse 13, "Is this not written in the book of Jasher? The sun stayed in the middle of the sky, and it did not hurry to go down about a whole day." And Joshua's men just toughed it out and fought through it. And that's where you and I have to be in the spiritual battle. We want to know that God will help us. We want to know that God will do miracles. God will keep our enemies at bay. God will supply our needs. God can supply us with food, drink, all kinds of things, supernatural strength. But then we look at the model of Joshua. There were great miracles that were wrought, but they played into it too. It's not the type of thing where you stand to the side and let God do all the fighting. Every once in a while, God will say, "I'll take care of this," but that's fairly rare. Generally, God's people have to be in the battle and fighting their best, and then God gives them the victory. So I wanted to share that tonight because I think, that there is an intense spiritual battle raging around us, and we have to know. I love the prophecies and stuff tonight. Carolyn, you said God is great, and that God is there for us. And then Frank, God saying, "I give you grace." And that's exactly right. All this miracle help and stuff, it's grace. And for God to say in the manifestations, "I give you grace," and he does. And then Dennis, as life brings trouble to you, I will be there. And we've got to believe that. We've got to believe that if life gives us trouble, God will be there. And he said he would inspire us He would instruct us. He would answer us. He would guide us. He would be with us. There was a whole list of things. I couldn't even get them all written down that God said he would do, and he will. And he'll do that for us. We have to have the confidence to get in the fight and the confidence to ask and then keep asking, and God will show up for us. So that's what I wanted to share tonight. I hope it's a blessing.